Much like the creature from the Black Lagoon, a certain queerness has always been present in the horror genre, lurking below its murky surface. Whether it's in its themes or the community that devours each film when released, queerness is present. There's no character in the amalgamation of media which best represents the struggles and lived realities of the queer individual, more than the titular character of the Child's Play series. The 2-foot-tall doll with his signature swath of red hair has spent the last 40 years of his cinematic history struggling to exist in a body in which he doesn't belong. His main drive as a character has always been to self-actualize his true self, or to be accepted for who he is by those around him, evocative of struggles faced by queer and trans persons today. He's a man trapped in an unknown body, even amongst his family, those with whom he should be able to share his true self. He's forced to keep his thoughts and identity hidden away in a metaphorical, and at times physical, closet, a body which externalizes the monstrous self-image contained within. He exists as someone onto whom we can project our own struggles, and, through his actions, a path forward. Chucky is a queer icon. Okay, I'm kidding. Well, only partially. I do believe that Chucky, the series and not the character, can provide a rich lens through which we can view the queer identity. Whether it's in its subtext, metatext, or even the less than subtle with each film, textual analysis available. Don Mancini, the original creator of Chucky, scriptwriter for the first iterations of the film and later its sole director, has admitted as much, whether it was intentional or not. And I believe the franchise is all the more better for it. So why not take a closer look? Sit back, enjoy, and welcome to the Witching Hour. Child's Play is an explosive franchise spanning a film series, a number of comic book spin-offs, novelizations, and most recently, a television show that has officially been confirmed for a second season. Over the span of 30-odd years, the franchise has come to involve culturally appropriative voodoo operating by film logic, soul transfers, soul splitting, resurrections and possessions, murder revenge plots that wouldn't be out of place in an Agatha Christie novel, and pessimistically realistic depictions of corporate and police corruption. So it's a little difficult to properly summarize, but what I can say is that the franchise provides more than ample evidence of a queer reading ripe to be plucked from the slasher tree, for anyone who gives it more than a surface glance. With that said, it can be a disjunctive experience to really lay it all out. And while jumping all over the place would definitely be queering the video essay narrative, it would be more than a little difficult to follow. While I've yet to read queer theory that wasn't, I wouldn't want to burden you with the same experience. With that said, I'll lay out each relevant film, talk a bit about how contextualized queer theory and queerness can be applied to that film, and then discuss connecting themes as they arise. But first, there's an issue here. What exactly is queerness? Some of you hear this term and think slur. Others might hear and think sexual identity. And a few of you may find yourself possessed by the spirit of Michel Foucault and screaming to the void that it's a prison. The reality is that it's really a bit of everything, with a healthy sprinkle of academic jargon. It exists at the post-structuralist intersections of various fields of study. It's feminist studies, continental philosophy, history, and so many others mixing and ebbing and forming a lens through which we examine. It's about taking situations and unraveling them, and it's twofold. It's about determining how situations relate to dominant power structures. Take, for example, the cis-heteropatriarchy. As the name implies, it's a system of power which exists at the intersections of patriarchy, heteronormativity, and cisgender supremacy. Think that one scene from Cronenberg's The Fly, but grosser. It takes aspects of personhood, like gender identity/presentation, wherever one falls on the biological sex spectrum, and sexual inclination, and creates a normative model which becomes valued by the society in which it's located. And any deviation is suppressed, cross the invisible line, and gets smacked down. Every identity which doesn't align perfectly with the ideal is othered and alienated. There's nothing innate about any of the previously mentioned categories that would make someone better or worse than another. Any and all socially produced inequalities are externally and coercively applied. To semi-plagiarize my favorite French existentialist, one is not born queer, but rather becomes it. And so queerness is both identifying these inequalities and elevating them, subverting them, taking differences as something transformative to be valued instead of hidden away. Second, a queer analysis is about centering modalities or modes of power and scrutinizing them. It's about putting power and how it manifests itself in society under a lens and discussing how power may be subverted. It could be as nebulous as the machinations of global economies, or as intimate as the family unit. It's really about where power originates and how it comes to exist. And in the film, how narratives and imagery can change our imagination of power. So while queerness may mean different things to you and others watching this video, this is the lens through which I'll be analyzing Chucky, Queerness, and the Child's Play series. With that said, if you're still watching, this is your last warning. Here be spoilers, up to and including the first season of Sci-Fi/USA's Chucky. Let's talk about Child's Play, the one that started it all. It's why you're here after all. Released in 1988, the film was directed by Tom Holland of Fright Night and Fatal Beauty fame, and produced by David Kirchner, who had recently finished producing An American Tail prior to working on the Child's Play project. Not exactly the expected theatrical follow-up, mind you. Finally, the film originated from a script by Don Mancini, who would come to be one of the most important creative voices behind the franchise and the biggest influence on the existing queer subtext within the series. Films, whether intentionally or not, tend to reflect the lived experiences, desires, and perspectives of whomever crafts them. While Holland and Kirchner were straight men, which in turn limits the extent to which the film embodied queer realities, Mancini was decidedly not, and a glimmer of his queer unconscious shone through in the script on which the film that we received was based. Mancini wrote the original script while studying at UCLA. It centered on a mother and her child being terrorized by the latter's doll, supernaturally possessed by the child's internalized rage. It's definitely a bit different than what we ended up getting. The skin of the script was flayed off, but its skeletal structure remained. A mother, her son, and a homicidal doll. Child's Play opens up with Charles Lee Ray, voiced by Brad Dourif. Yes, that Brad Dourif, the notorious Lakeshore Strangler, being chased by law enforcement. Injured, he takes shelter in a toy store. Gunned down and dying, he uses a voodoo ritual to transfer his soul into the nearest vessel, a good guy doll, the fictionalized, mass-marketed toy that was a must-have for every child in this fictional universe. A side note, it's extremely problematic that a major plot device of the series relies on a satirization of Afro-Caribbean religion, but we'll get back to that later. The toy, containing the soul of Charles Lee Ray, unbeknownst to anyone, eventually finds its way into the hands of Karen Barkley, portrayed fantastically by Catherine Hicks. As a single mother raising a young son, she wanted to get him the perfect gift, one whose commercial had him glued to the television every morning. Andy Barkley wanted a friend till the end. What he got was Chucky. Andy is thrilled to have a best friend, but folks around him start to become concerned when they learn that Chucky talks to him, especially as a lot of people start dying around him. Charles Lee Ray is alive, and his only means of escaping his silicone prison is to transfer his soul into Andy Barkley. Karen Barkley and Detective Norris, the one who had killed Lee Ray in the first place, find out about his game of musical chairs but with souls. They hunt him down and fry him to a crisp. Curtains close on Chucky. For now. There are a few things I'd like to talk about regarding this film, one of which is how Andy and his mother are positioned in this universe. While not explicit in the narrative, Andy's biological father isn't in the picture. In fact, in interviews done after the fact, we learn that he died in an accident years prior. And so, Karen Barkley is portrayed on screen as a single mother raising Andy on her own, with the help of her friend and coworker. He's without a male figure in his life. However, it's never viewed as a negative. It's value neutral, or if anything, positive, especially when contrasted with other films in its era. You see, films have a tendency to reinforce social norms. They are tools of ideology, after all. In a way, they act as cultural propaganda for how those adhering to normalcy ought to act, how they ought to look, and how they ought to form relationships. Horror films, especially in the 80s, were notorious as to how they approached social norms, and those that violated them. There are rules to follow, and if you don't, The natural forces within the film will punish you.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex.
The family unit was no different. Films pushed a heteronormative interpretation of the family, one led by the patriarch. Anything that stepped outside of that model was made an example of. Except for the Child's Play franchise, where the unorthodox family structure was a source of strength and resilience, ultimately leading to Chucky's eventual demise in each iteration. Take a look at Carrie. The titular character of the film is a bullied teenager who is emotionally abused by her mother, unlocks pyrokinetic abilities, and uses them on those who had wronged her. The parental abuse that Carrie suffered originated in the misogynistic hyper-religiosity of her mother. This behavior, which ultimately contributed to Carrie's mental deterioration, was exacerbated after the death of her husband, Carrie's father. The unorthodox single-parent household was platformed as something dangerous, and of which we should be wary. Child's Play, on the other hand, positions its unorthodox family structure and feminist child rearing as a source of strength. Mancini states as much in an interview with CBR, Comic Book Resources. I think it had to do with my very conflicted relationship with my own dad growing up as a gay man with a macho father whose greatest nightmare in the world was that I would become gay. In a way, it was revenge. There is no dad. He's dead. Mancini hammers this point in the recent television series by subverting the familial portrayal we had with Little Andy and Karen Barkley. In Chucky, the television series, Jake Wheeler is a queer teenager. He spends his time perusing the local garage sale circuit for dolls to decapitate and dismember for his art projects. We were all 14 once. A kid needs to have hobbies. His mother died years prior and he's raised by his father, a man's man, fixing cars during the day and getting blackout drunk at night. He's disturbed by his child's artistic inclination and physically abuses Jake for playing with dolls. Traits that have been historically seen as deviations to societal heteronormativity, and which are projected as effeminate to the viewer, as seen in comments made not only by his father, but others around him. Both the Barkleys and the Wheelers queer the family unit as portrayed in film in their own unique way. The first displays an unorthodox family which platforms feminist values, and an emotionally/financially healthy family. The absence of the father is never seen as a source of weakness or barrier to overcome for the Barkleys, whereas the latter peels away reality that is all too common for many queer kids in families that center heterosexuality, but is never revealed, warts and all, to media consumers. Its sequels unconsciously follow this trend. Child's Play 2 focuses on Andy, who was placed in the foster care system after his mother was institutionalized. It turns out ramblings of killer dolls don't play well with societal norms concerning mental health. Andy Barkley is placed with the Simpsons. No, not that family, the Simpsons. Andy is obviously traumatized by his encounter with Chucky, but he slowly acclimates to his new home alongside his foster sister Kyle, who, with a look like that, is sort of an icon herself. Capitalists rebuild Chucky for science, Chucky escapes, finds Andy, and the usual hijinks ensue. Their foster parents are killed by the possessed doll, and Chucky continues to attempt to use contrived voodoo magic to transfer his soul into Andy's body. After the Simpson patriarch is murdered in what is deemed an accident, Andy is taken away by Child Protective Services, his foster mother, blaming him for the death of her husband. Soon after, Kyle discovers her body, the latest product of Chucky's handiwork. He holds her hostage and forces her to chase Andy, although she cleverly escapes alongside Andy and they take refuge in a good guy doll factory. After a suspenseful chase scene and final act, Andy and Kyle survive, but what family they managed to forge was destroyed along with Chucky. Now, I find this movie fascinating, and not only because it's one of the best films in the series. Seriously, the cinematography is amazing, the shots are so unique. Like, check out this series of bottom-up shots, as if the camera, and we the viewer, were a small child or a doll on the floor. And these close-ups and wide shots, which manage to translate a sort of claustrophobia in each scene, like the characters are trapped in their own good guy doll boxes. And all this is without going into the acting, set design, and writing that really make this such a wry little gift for the average horror enjoyer. I really like this film if you couldn't tell. But that's not why I find this film so interesting for the thesis of this video. And just like the first film, this one plays with the concept of family and what makes a family. The Simpsons are portrayed as the idyllic nuclear family. You have the breadwinner, the housewife, and their two children, one boy and one girl. All that's missing is a laugh track. Yet its complete facade, one that the Simpsons try to maintain. They push notions of family value, encouraging the children to join them to eat breakfast, quote unquote, as a family. The foster mother gently berates Kyle for choosing to work rather than spend the evening with, quote unquote, the family. To which Kyle responds that she'll need the money as she'll be on her own next year, having aged out of the foster care system. The foster mom responds with, quote,
"Until then, you're with us."
The illusion cracks, and while it doesn't have priority in the film, these moments continue to present themselves to the viewer. You see, Andy and Kyle aren't seen as children in need of affection or love, but instead as furnishings in her life. At one point, Chucky infiltrates the household and breaks a statuette, for which Andy is blamed. It's a simple moment, but just like so many in this film, I love it for its subtle implications. To their foster mom, Andy and Kyle are no different than this heirloom. They're a prize to be displayed in their attempt at suburbia. However, in the background of this illusion of the nuclear family, Andy and Kyle, who were complete strangers at the beginning of the film, form a real bond and create the cohesive foundations of their own family, as the mirage around them dissipates. Found family, a chosen family. These concepts go beyond any sort of academic theorization as to what queer is. According to research conducted by the Family Acceptance Project out of San Francisco University, 30% of youth face some sort of rejection from their biological or adoptive parents when they reveal their sexual orientation. The stats are no better for children and teenagers who display gender variance. They're more at risk of homelessness, abuse, and violence than their cis-het counterparts, the majority of which stems from their parents and their relationship with family. And so it's no surprise that teenagers who fall outside of cis-heteronormative expectations may embrace their family's rejection and seek out a new one that they've chosen, one that's chosen them. And that's what Andy and Kyle formed, a chosen family, one of the foundational experiences of queer youth, whether intentional or not. Family isn't limited to these first couple films, but it's something that's continued to be a threading theme throughout the entire franchise. Both Bride of Chucky and the television series prominently shows teenagers or young adults not fitting within their family structures and finding a new one amongst themselves. Heck, the entire plot of Sea of Chucky is triggered exclusively because our protagonists want to find a family and their roots. The third film is, well, okay, so there's not much to say here. This one was written while Child's Play 2 was still in production, on the insistence of the studio, like wringing out a moist rag for the last droplets of revenue, which I believe mostly justifies some of the quality issues of this film compared to others, as well as its casual racism, but hey, maybe we'll save that for another video. Andy is aged up and is shipped to a military boarding school. Capitalism brings back Chucky, again, for profit. Okay, you know what? I'm starting to think that commercialism and capitalism are the true villains of the series. Chucky quickly escapes and goes to find Andy. He arrives at the academy and, as per usual, starts murdering from the get-go. Gotta love a working class man who just puts everything he has into what he loves doing. The film ends when Andy and his friends defeat Chucky by throwing him into a giant death fan, which I'm pretty sure is an OSHA compliant. This was the film that put Child's Play into a deep sleep for nearly 10 years before Mancini and Kirshner petitioned for a sequel. Unfortunately, there's not much to discuss regarding the inherent queerness of Child's Play 3. I guess an argument could be made towards the hypermasculine and homoerotic nature of the military complex, which briefly makes an appearance in the film, or Chucky's experimentation with makeup, or even the behavior of the school's barber and his obsession with hair, which legitimately borders on paraphilic at times. These are all deviations, but more often than not they're played for laughs, and they're not really challenging any sort of existing structures, nor are they contributing towards positive on-screen portrayals of queerness. After Child's Play 3, the series was ostensibly shelved by the studio, but Mancini and Kirshner began working on a sequel, one that would take it into a whole new, queerer direction. If you're a millennial like me, your first experience with the Child's Play series is probably when you convince your parents to rent Bride and/or Seed of Chucky at your local Blockbuster. It's about dolls, it's probably not even that violent, a decision that they would definitely soon regret. And so Bride and Seed had a huge impact on my formative horror years. And I wasn't the only one. The redesign of Chucky in these films became so iconic that most folks, when they think of Chucky, have this look in mind. Not this one, and God forbid, this one. Moreover, with the development of Bride of Chucky came more creative control for Mancini, who continued to write scripts and would later direct every film following Bride. With that control came the ability to push the series in his preferred direction, writing roles and casting actors with that intent. To have a piece of media, one that can act as a vehicle of identity for Mancini and others that resemble him, that resemble us, really. And Mancini was thrilled to queerify Child's Play as much as he could, and one of the ways in which he applied that approach was through representation and inclusion of gay cultural elements. Yes, representation in culture. Ostensibly the most overt way in which Chucky's inherent queerness is viewable to the audience. And there's a lot of it, starting with The Bride of Chucky. Bride of Chucky was essentially a soft reboot of the franchise, both thematically and in its setting. It begins with Chucky's remains being ferreted out of an evidence locker after years of gathering dust by a corrupt cop, who proceeds to sell them to a mysterious woman. She almost immediately slits his throat, practices extremely unsafe murder hygiene, and leaves with the doll's remains. Cue title card. As we learn, this woman is Tiffany, or Tiff as her lovers and soon-to-be murder victims know her by. She's the partner of the Silicon-imprisoned Charles Lee Ray, and is still madly in love with him. Tiff uses voodoo magic to resurrect Chucky, and it works. As an aside, I just love the direction in which they went with this. Mancini wasn't too thrilled by the inclusion of bastardized voodoo in the first film, and I'm not sure whether it's because he found it to be appropriative and offensive towards practicing communities, or whether he found it to be a tacky, overwrought film trope, but he spins how it's used in this film by having Tiff literally reading verbatim from a Voodoo for Dummies manual, and later, Chucky citing precise chapter and page numbers like a tired English professor lecturing to a class of high schoolers. Back to the film. Soon after he's brought to life, Chucky murders Tiff and transfers her soul into another doll vessel after a domestic squabble. The only way they can return to their human bodies is if they locate this film's MacGuffin, a magical voodoo amulet that allows the person who possesses it to transfer their soul between vessels. But it's buried in a New Jersey graveyard. However will they get there? Their tiny little feet can't reach the pedals. And so they hire Jesse, a local teenager, to transport their plastic bodies all the way there, along with his girlfriend, Jade. They manage to get there, with a few bumps/murders along the road, of course. The film ends with Jade and Jesse tricking their silicone counterparts and managing to defeat Chucky and Tiff. But not before Tiff gives birth to a gremlin monster of her own. And that's Bride, more or less. It was radically different from its earlier iterations. Rather than resurrecting its thriller roots with occasional gleamings of dark humor,
Ugly doll.
Fuck you.
the film took direct inspiration from intertextual, that is to say, self-aware and self-referential media of the time, like Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer, to transform itself. It became a piece of media from which dark humor was inseparable from its horror, mostly fueled by Brad Dourif's iconic laugh, itself inseparable from Chucky's. It also began a legacy of queerness in the identities of characters. Of the dozen or so characters, a quarter of them were either portrayed as gay, played by queer/out actors, or a little column A and a little column B. Tiff, who would become a fan favorite, was played by Jennifer Tilly, who had previously starred in Bound, a criminal thriller directed by the Wachowskis. The film featured a pair of lesbians as its main protagonists. Unabashed in its portrayal of same-gender romance and sex, the film quickly gathered a cult following amongst LGBTQ audiences. While not directly seen in this film, we later learned that her character, Tiff, is bisexual, attracted to any gender, more interested in what's on the inside than out. However, even without the sexuality of the characters revealed, Tilly's flamboyance on screen as well as her cult following amongst LGBTQ communities exemplified her as a form of queer representation. And that's not to say that the film is without its portrayal of queer characters who explicitly identify as queer. One character that I failed to mention in my summary of the film is David, a recurring character who's best friends with both Jesse and Jade. He's upstanding, polite, the sort of boy that every father wishes their daughter would bring home. Oh, and he's gay. Which is fantastic, considering how low the bar was in 1996. Sure, there were on-screen gay characters since the 70s, like All in the Family or Golden Girls, but every single portrayal of a queer character existed as a setup, or sometimes the punchline itself, to a poorly aged joke. And in situations in which the character wasn't an amalgamation of queer stereotypes created by heteronormative societal structures, their role was almost exclusively to help our protagonists work out some deep-seated homophobia before being whisked away, never to be seen or heard from again, like some sort of magical homosexual. To have an openly gay character positively portrayed in a way which didn't center his sexuality was a rarity, and one that was intentional by Mancini, although, as we'll touch on later, unproblematic can be problematic in its own right. The film also featured Alexis Arquette. While not out as trans yet, she was well known for being gay and actively portraying gay characters, as well as playing some which played with her interpretation of gendered expectations. Although often these, like previously mentioned, tended to be two-dimensional and positioned whomever she was playing as a source of humor, rather than any sort of grounded humanist interpretation worthy of relatability or sympathy. While she played a character of a gender different than her own in this film, Damien Baylock, she subverted expectations of masculinity in the character's portrayal. Compared to other male characters in the film, Damien was presented as slender and effeminate, with long hair and makeup. The only humor her character produced was not based in sexuality, but the revelation that they weren't some hardened outcast goth, but a nerdy office worker. The joke wasn't queerness, but someone firmly part of the heteronormative machine pretending to be someone they're not. Alexis Arquette as a celebrity in the queer community, as well as her long-standing career as a drag queen under the moniker of Eva Destruction, was positioned in this film as a queer actor, playing a queer character, and embodying queer culture. We still have progress to make in terms of how producers approach LGBTQ representation on the silver screen, but to have a film so unabashedly highlight queer characters and cast queer actors to fill roles, whether they're straight or gay, especially in a horror film, is something to be celebrated and upheld. Representation is needed. It's something that's invaluable. If you're straight and/or cisgender, you may not realize the psychological need for positive representation in the media we consume. Time and time again, studies have concluded that positive portrayals of LGBTQ characters in media correlate positively with an increase in the self-esteem, self-worth, and the ability to properly externalize one's unique sexual and gender expressions amongst queer and trans youth. Considering that 27% of LGBTQ moviegoers prioritize horror over any other genre when going to the cinema according to a Nielsen study, it demonstrates the need for horror to prioritize representation, even if that representation is likely to become roadkill or barbecued. And I'm certain that Mancini realizes this. Growing up consuming North American media, he had to deal with the same lack of representation most LGBTQ community members of his generation had to confront. Whether conscious or unconscious, Mancini made a positive change to the Child's Play series, which reverberated and touched BBQs, who may have been watching his films for the first time, like me. There's a heartfelt moment in the TV show in which Jake Wheeler, our queer protagonist, confesses his feelings towards his friend Devin, and he reciprocates those feelings. In the same episode, we see them holding hands at school and sharing a kiss. It's not forced, nor did it feel performative in any way. It was a natural and vulnerable moment of which the viewer was given the opportunity to be a part of. I had to stop watching at this point and compose myself. I was tearing up. Over the past couple of decades, queer people have been given more space in fictional media, as long as they don't perform their queerness in any way. Take Modern Family, a sitcom critically panned for its inclusion of a gay couple, yet there's no on-screen displays of affection. A couple that's been canonically together for years share one of their few on-screen kisses in the background, a peck really, in its second season. Gay characters are allowed to exist, as long as they follow a rigid, heteronormative model of queerness, which excludes romantic and sexual expression. And if they don't, well, chances are they're not going to live too long. There's a reason why the bury your gays trope is so well known. And so when I saw these scenes, I was ecstatic. I was also scared. I didn't know if they would even live to the end of that episode. Queer love and happiness are signifiers of death, after all. This is a spoiler. They do. They live. So not only do they live, but they give the opportunity to queer teenagers who might be watching to see representation of same-gender romance amongst kids their own age, to experience a happy ending for its queer characters that other shows or films may withhold. Representational queerness isn't just having characters who are gay or gender diverse, it's about the inclusion of culture, but most importantly, it's about subversions and the transgressions of normativity, and how those normative structures do their best to construct queerness as a certain kind of deviation. The casting of Jennifer Tilly and Alexis Arquette firmly positions A Bride of Chucky as a queer film, not because of the sexualities of these actors, but because of their status as queer icons immortalized in LGBTQ culture. And the romance we see between Jake and Devon upsets fictional narratives surrounding queer love. With all that said, it brings us to Seed of Chucky. Oh, Seed. My poor misunderstood baby. Released 8 years after Bride of Chucky in 2004, the film was considered a critical failure. Although it had brought in double its production budget of $12 million, it was ravaged by critics. In his review for the film, Roger Ebert said the following about Seed of Chucky. If you're thinking of it as a horror movie, you can forget about it. It's not scary. If you do not by now find Chucky and the other killer dolls tiresome, I do. This is their 5th movie. If you like the way Jennifer Tilly has fun with her image, and in what can only be described as selfless generosity, with Gina Gershon's image, Seed of Chucky is a movie to be seen on television. Free television. Of course, we already know that Roger Ebert isn't too thrilled by the concept of horror films.
I think a lot of people have the wrong idea. They identify these films with earlier thrillers like Psycho, or even a more recent film like Halloween, which we both liked. These films aren't in the same category. These films hate women. And unfortunately, the audiences that go to them don't seem to like women too much either. Now, we go to see these films in movie theaters.
So we can take his opinions with a drop of blood. If they weren't shared by countless other critics, of course. It's a massive shame, because most of the bad criticism comes out of trying to view Seed of Chucky as you would any other horror film, when it's anything but. In the final scene of Bride of Chucky, both Chucky and Tiff are defeated by that film's protagonists. When a detective examines the scene of the crime, it ends in a jump scare. A small doll monster is ejected from under Tiff's dress and murders the detective, revealing that Tiff was pregnant. Seed of Chucky begins from that point, years after the event. We learn that the baby doll monster grew up to become a child doll, to whom we're introduced to as Glenn. Glenn is a pacifist, unlike their bloodlust-obsessed parents, and is traumatized by nightly nightmares of murder. They escape from a British goth ventriloquist who had been holding them hostage. Discovering that the bodies of their parents are being used as props in a film retelling the good guy doll murders, Glenn runs away to find them, and accidentally resurrects them using the previous film's MacGuffin. Chucky and Tiff are surprised by the existence of their child, with each one insisting that Glenn is either a boy or a girl, respectively. And Glenn's gender expression and perceived gender identity continues to be a recurring theme over the course of the film. The other main plotline focuses on Chucky and Tiff attempting to acquire new human vessels into whom they can transfer their souls, one of whom is the actress Jennifer Tilly, playing herself. And yes, there are scenes where Jennifer Tilly is playing Jennifer Tilly, counter to Tiff, voiced by Jennifer Tilly and previously portrayed by Jennifer Tilly.
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
While unconscious, they artificially inseminate her to create a vessel for their child. Tilly's assistant interrupts the soul transfer process, at which point she's flambéed by someone wearing a white dress and blonde hair. It's Tiff's signature look, so we assume that's her. But in a twist, it's revealed to be Glenn. And as we soon learn, this version of them goes by Glenda. Chucky ultimately rejects transferring his soul as he prefers who he is and the reputation he's created rather than the alternative. Glenn/Glenda defeats Chucky and the film ends with the audience learning that the soul transfer was successful and that Tiff, Glenn, and Glenda each possess their own human vessel. After hearing the summary, you may have noticed some problems yourself. One issue that many had with Seed of Chucky compared to other films in the franchise is that it dived directly into its dark humor, more comedy than horror, and it made no excuse for crossing that categorical line. Fans of the series who had long followed Child's Play and even some introduced through Bride of thought it had gone too far. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely some pretty visible flaws, such as its casual racism or skirting over the aforementioned artificial insemination scene. But what I want to do first and foremost is highlight how Seed of Chucky continues the trend of queerness in the Child's Play series, both in terms of representation of on-screen actors and characters, and the inclusion of queer themes. The most obvious inclusion of queer representation is in the portrayal of Glenn/Glenda. While slightly problematic through a contemporary lens, the inclusion of a character who was quite frank about their gender identity falling outside of the gender binary, with it not being played for laughs, was something somewhat revolutionary. That is to say that it upset expectations concerning gender at the time of its release. Moreover, The naming of the character, and to an extent their portrayal, was intentional. It was a nod and a love letter to infamous director Ed Wood. A schlocky film director, he wasn't shy about his inclination towards public cross-dressing. One of Wood's first films was Glenn or Glenda, a semi-biographical film about transvestism. While there are more than enough reasons to criticize Wood as a creative, it was unique in its time for its depiction of gender expression, and, similarly to Wood, the film drew a line between gender presentation and sexuality, separating the two in the eyes of the audience. While it's definitely not aged well,
there, in the lesser civilized part of the world, it's the male who adorns himself with a fancy object, such as...
Its intertextual weaving into the narrative of Seed of Chucky only elevates its inherent queerness, and shows a certain level of intention behind the themes of queer identity we've been highlighting throughout this video. With all that said, there are some problems with how Glenn/Glenda is portrayed that ultimately cause more harm than it does benefit the queer community, which I'll cover towards the end of this essay. And so, Seed of Chucky manages some representation, but just like Bride of Chucky, that's only one part of its inherent queerness. It's also significant for its inclusion of gay culture, and if there's one aspect of gay culture that Seed of Chucky masterfully asserts throughout its runtime, that other horror films of the era failed to recognize, and that's camp.
It's camp! The tragically ludicrous? The ludicrously tragic?
Oh yeah, like when a clown died.
Now, camp is as amorphous as queerness. To some, camp is limited to fashion, like the dressage of performers who participate in ballroom culture, events which amalgamate modeling, lip-syncing, dancing, etc. To others, camp describes everything which makes ballroom culture what it is. Without any one of those aspects, its campiness would cease to exist. Here's the biggest issue when it comes to defining camp and providing a list of criteria. At best, it's esoteric, and at worst, it's a meaningless label. The critical consensus is that camp describes something whose value originates in its bad taste, a sort of sensibility, but taste is incredibly subjective. There is no way to scientifically determine whether something's of good taste, same as you can't scientifically determine whether something's camp. And that's a question that writer Susan Sontag tackled in her 1964 essay, Notes on Camp. She positioned camp as a sort of sensibility, an aesthetic form, something which, if turned into a system, to be applied onto media, is no longer camp. In other words, you have to be loosey-goosey in your examination of what is or isn't camp. There is a sort of logic, but it's nebulous. While I could go over this in more detail, I'll put a link to her essay in the description and highly recommend that you read the article on your own. Instead, I'll use certain points of her essay to describe how Seed of Chucky, as well as the entire series, embodies camp aesthetics. Camp isn't just bad art or kitschiness through any perspective. Its terribleness must be seen through a serious point of view. And according to that line, most, if not all, horror films would fall under this umbrella. As a genre, horror is often derided and criticized as an art form. Simply by existing as a horror film, the Child's Play franchise has begun its journey into camp. And yes, I am implying that all horror films embody a little bit of queerness in their own way. According to Sontag, the essential element of camp is seriousness, but specifically one that fails in being serious. And that's the entire concept of a killer doll. The viewer is supposed to fear the slasher, but it's near impossible to take Chucky seriously as any sort of viable threat, as long as you have the lights on, of course. But these films expect you to take Chucky seriously as a threat to our protagonists. Ironically, Chucky only exists as a danger if those he wants to kill assume that he's a toy and don't take him seriously. It's all about dethroning the serious. Most who watch Child's Play aren't doing it to get some sort of treatise on the anguish of death and violence. We watch Child's Play because of the dark humor and anti-seriousness that underlines each kill in every film. Camp is marked by a strong overemphasis and performance of personal characteristics like gender, whether it's in characters performing garish exaggerations of expected gender expressions like the hypermasculine, the hyperfeminine, or the hypersexualized, or whether it's going against the grain of those same expectations in the form of androgyny. And we can see examples of this throughout the franchise. Take Tiff. From her first on-screen appearance, every outfit she wears while alive veers into the hyperfeminine/hypersexual. Perfect hair and perfect makeup. It's 10 a.m. Tiff. High heels and mini dresses are not appropriate attire for disposing of a body. Also, one of the first things she does after being resurrected into a doll's body is to give herself a complete makeover, embodying the same hyper-feminine, hypersexual look she had when alive. And let's be honest, it's an absolutely iconic look. I mean, personally, I would have other priorities if I found myself in her doll shoes, but to each their own. And Tiff isn't the only way this film plays with the camp possibility of gender. Nika Pierce, the protagonist from Curse of Chucky and Cult of Chucky, is possessed by Chucky by the end of the latter. Throughout the television series which follows Cult of, Nika is exclusively portrayed in outfits which highlight the character's androgyny. Even the portrayal of Charles Lee Ray in flashbacks veers into this territory. His perpetual suit is loose-fitting, and his greasy hair is long and black, falling below his shoulders. To add to the androgyny and the way this film plays with gender, he's played by Fiona Dourif, the same actor for Nika Pierce, with the original voice of Chucky, Brad Dourif, dubbed over. And so our expectations of gender, both in the character and in its actor, are subverted. We experience camp in our viewing as much as Fiona Dourif embodies camp in her performance. Double also, if you're doubting whether Seed of Chucky is camp or whether there's some degree of intention on the part of Mancini, I'd like to bring your attention to this character, the paparazzi Pete Peters, played by John Waters, director of Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble, and the father of the trash genre. Many of his films are the golden standard of camp. They are the epitome of anti-seriousness, of bad art in the eyes of the mainstream. It's good because it's awful. The inclusion of John Waters only helps in signaling the camp nature of Seed of Chucky, and supporting the argument that there's inherent queerness in the film. Okay, slight retraction. The sole inclusion of John Waters doesn't mean that there's an inherent queerness. However, it exists in conjunction with every other piece we've laid out so far, which does lead to that conclusion. Before I continue, I think it's important to acknowledge a massive gap in some of the arguments I've been making. I have been taking some things for granted, and I've been making some assumptions. For example, the mere inclusion of camp ties Chucky and Child's Play to gay culture and subsequently queerness. It's true that camp isn't limited exclusively to LGBTQ-oriented media, but it is an aesthetic form that's been highly valued almost universally amongst queer cultures. However, and this is more than a huge gap in this part of the argument, queerness isn't a monolith. It's often treated as if it were by those on the outside and even by some in-group members sometimes. I mean, I've definitely fallen victim to it a bit myself throughout this essay. Gay culture, queerness, LGBTQ community. It's important to keep in mind when speaking on these topics that there's almost a rhetorical need to speak in generalities. You can't throw blanket assumptions onto our community because we're not the pot people from Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We're not one singular mind, nor are we a collective, as those within the greater society reflexively and insensibly assume. But, and this is a big but, we can talk about intercultural intersections, interests that we've either developed or that we've subvertedly appropriated. I'm not too big on Celine Dion or Lady Gaga, but I'd have to be wearing cultural blinders not to view their music as something that has been integral to gay culture. And so, while themes I've discussed may not pertain to every member of the LGBTQ community, it doesn't mean that they're not part of the queer subculture, and in turn, have the ability to queer media which integrate them. Returning briefly to camp, and in the words of Susan Sontag, while it's not true that camp taste is homosexual taste, there is no doubt a particular affinity and overlap. We're nearing the end of this video essay, and by now you've more than likely noticed that I'm a little biased towards Child's Play. It's true, I really enjoy the franchise. It was one of my first exposures to horror, and it triggered a lifelong interest in the genre that has only been compounded with the recent television show. When we enjoy something, it can be hard to be critical of it, especially when there are criticisms to be made in the themes you just spent the last week writing about, and now the last half hour speaking of. But I think it's important. For all the ways that Chucky embodies a certain inherent queerness, the franchise fails in addressing certain issues and simultaneously falls into the same blind spots of productions created exclusively by cisgender and heterosexual creatives. So let's talk about it. And while it's true that Child's Play has integrated more and more queer representation amongst its cast of characters over the years, it fails to represent a diversity of gender/sexual expressions in its portrayal of queerness. Those who are included and indeed deemed to be valued fall into a particular queerness, queer without being queer. Whereas the inclusion of queerness may appear to naturally counter heteronormativity in fiction, the latter defends itself by absorbing and transforming deviation into something similar to itself. Queerness is no longer radical, but instead it's part of the hegemonic order. It becomes homonormative. Popularized by Lisa Duggan at the turn of the century, homonormativity denotes a certain sexual political perspective, one that arose out of the Republican log cabin institution. It primarily identifies the depoliticization of queerness and its adoption of the hegemon, or should I say, its adoption by the hegemon. As put forth by Duggan, it's a discursive practice which remaps the boundaries of queerness. That is to say, the transformation of performing deviance in the eyes of the heteronormative structure into something which denies its former civil rights agenda. Instead of dismantling public institutions which formalize homophobia and transphobia in society in the form of existing government structures or market capitalism, it thrives on internalizing LGBTQ community members, at least those who fit normative assumptions, into those same existing institutions that they had previously sought to dismantle. Queers whose mere existence threatened the sanctity of the social script of heterosexuality were now welcomed to follow it, an initiation into normalcy. Monogamy, marriage, childbearing, all of these became aspects of homonormativity. There was still a line, of course, an indication of deviancy, of in-group/out-groupness, but it was now applied to those who failed or who refused the traditional indoctrination of homonormativity. While Child's Play was inclusive of queer representation as early as 1996's Bride of Chucky, it failed to properly represent queerness in a way which didn't embody homonormative ideals. David is one of those characters, the problematic and the unproblematic. While queer representation in its own right subverts normative expectations of sexuality, any transgression is defanged when applied through the lens of homonormativity. With David, there is nothing exactly queer about the character. There are no signifiers, cultural markers that would suggest a certain reality, that point towards his sexuality being different than the expected norm, that being heterosexuality. To be a little crude, there's nothing gay about David's portrayal. In the same breath that David introduces queer representation into the franchise, so too does he introduce homonormativity. And homonormative representation isn't limited to Bride of Chucky. In Cult of Chucky, the 7th film in the franchise, man, they really made a bunch of these. We're introduced to Carlos, a nurse in a medium-security psychiatric hospital. There's nothing really extraordinary about the character, although we learn that he's gay or bisexual through his mentioning of having a husband. The latter has MS, and Carlos cares for him, otherwise humanizing a character that is ultimately responsible for overseeing the incarceration of our protagonist. His queerness is an afterthought, and while it contributes towards the inclusivity of queerness in the franchise, it also contributes towards the development of a homonormative model of queerness which is acceptable to represent. An argument could be made that Mancini and others chose to include queer representation without queer signifiers to normalize the inclusion of LGBTQ representation and tackle stereotypes which had developed in the medium. But by doing so, the production crew behind these films allowed these characters to be absorbed into a hegemonic projection of heteronormativity. Alternatively, Mancini and co. could have portrayed queer characters, warts and all, and appropriated those negative value traits into something positive. Which is why I value Tiff and Mika/Chucky as representations of queerness. They're not supposed to be idealized, they're objectively evil, but they reject ideals which fall outside of homo/heteronormativity. And whenever they did associate themselves with a social script, it was exemplified as a perversion of the institution. Chucky and Tiff marrying in Bride of, whilst surrounded by freshly killed corpses, subverts the expectations of purity of the institution of marriage. They have a child, but their assumptions of child-rearing encircle murder and killing as a family tradition. Theirs is a social script, but one that corrupts the intent of heteronormativity. Corruption and deviancy embodies every aspect of the relationship. Once Chucky possesses the body of Nika, the relationship continues to reject the normalcy given by the adoption of the social script, transferring the rejection of heteronormativity onto homonormativity. Similar to Divine and Pink Flamingos, Chucky and Tiff embrace filth. They embrace deviancy. Do I have to say more? And they're not the only examples of queer deviancy to which we're exposed. While relatively minor characters in the grand scheme of the Child's Play series, Curse of Chucky introduces Barb, the sister of Nika, along with her husband Ian and their child's nanny Jill. The film hints towards a possible affair between Ian and Jill, but as we find out, it's Barb and Jill who are having the affair. Few of those watching have sympathy for the couple, and ultimately they're positioned as improper representations of queerness. Their transgression of the social script of hetero/homonormativity ultimately leads to their deaths. But honestly, it's great to have them on screen, and we should be supportive of their presence. They contribute towards a wider expression of queerness and dispel any notions that the on-screen queer must be without fault to receive value. Instead, they're villains, and we're meant to dislike them. Not because they violate the unspoken social script of homonormativity, but because of their personality. I never thought I'd be praising a film character for having a bad personality. Or heck, what about the hair fetishist from Child's Play 3? I'm sure there's something there, and he's anything but likable. But we're pressed for time, so let's move on. It's important to note that homonormativity isn't only reinforced through the portrayal of characters which adhere to its value structure, but by continuing to other members of the LGBTQ community who, as previously stated, failed or who refused the traditional indoctrination of homonormativity. These failures can be intentional on the part of the other, but more often than not, they're marginalized by the dominant group because of some immutable and perceivable trait. Assumptions and stereotypes roll downhill. There's always a need to punch down after all. In Seed of Chucky, we see this in the form of Glenda, where Glenn is a pacifist who refuses to hurt even a fly. Glenda finds joy in roasting the working class alive. She wears ill-fitting clothing and garish makeup. Her brief on-screen portrayal is marked by violence and a manic mental state. All of these are traits which are less than rarely applied to trans feminine persons across reality and social media. Any outburst or display of emotion is deemed evidence of mental illness. Violence, whether the assumption, threat of, or its enactment, is evidence of internalized male socialization, or that the trans feminine individual will never truly be a woman after all, because women can never be violent, of course. In this sense, Seed of Chucky regurgitates stereotypes surrounding the overperformance, violence, and derangement of trans femininity. It's important to make 2 points here. The first being that these sorts of betrayals are often unintentional. Even well-meaning projects can reify existing structures, which continue the oppression of marginalized populations. Considering the effort that Mancini injected into the series and the way in which his queer representation in the franchise has evolved, I don't think that there is any degree of ill intent or intentionality in the faults that I've laid out here. Secondly, the Chucky franchise has only progressed in its inclusion of queerness. The betrayal of Jake Wheeler, confirming Glenn/Glenda's gender-fluid identity,
Gender fluid.
and the continuous ways that the show plays with gender indicates a growth and evolution which the franchise has allowed itself to integrate. There's progress to be made, but at least we're not starting from zero. And now, dear listener, I have a confession to make to you. I've lied. I've lied to you. Child's Play might be a queer series. The underlying themes of family, of rejection, and the inclusion of queer culture and of queer actors/characters does create an undercurrent of queerness for viewers to latch onto. But Chucky, the doll, isn't queer. Far from it. His position and actions within each film are consistently adversarial to any of the queer themes we've just mentioned. He embodies the oppression that queer children face by abusive parents. His relationship with Andy is one marked by terror and belittlement. While the relationship may be excused due to the fact that Chucky wants to, steal Andy's body, and in later films murder him, that isn't the case with Jake. Throughout the first half of the television show, Chucky grooms Jake. He convinces Jake that he's his friend till the end. Yet he's no different than Jake's biological father. In one scene, Jake talks back to him, and in the next, we see that Jake has a black eye. It's implied that Chucky assaulted him for talking back, something his own father used to do. A few scenes later, he apologizes, promising never to do that again. Words I'm sure some of you have heard before. And later, when at the mercy of Andy and Jake, Chucky appeals to their emotions and gaslights them, as if he hadn't spent the last hour trying to murder them. He insults Jake and calls him gay for being open about his emotions and love for Devon. In Bride of Chucky, his sexism is on full display. He continuously belittles Tiff, her mother, and later complains about pop music and criticizes any attempts to change his quote-unquote classic style of killing. He insists that Glenn/Glenda identify as a boy, and refuses to entertain the notion that they might feel like either or at different times, all the while pushing them to adopt a more masculine persona. In effect, Chucky becomes a stand-in for the structure of cis-heteropatriarchy that the film's been subverting up to this point through its inclusion of queer/feminist themes and representation. He's no different in personality than your boomer uncle at Thanksgiving who's been watching a little too much Fox News. Chucky isn't queer. Instead, he becomes representative of the systems which seek to oppress and destroy the marginalized. And the continuous success of our protagonists, in a way, suggests that queers, those who reject homonormativity, may themselves one day find success in battling their oppressors. I guess that's it. Thank you so much for spending the last hour of your life watching this silly video essay. It means a lot that you chose to dedicate your time, one of your most limited resources, to this mini-doc. Want to see more? Have suggestions for topics I should cover? Disagree completely with everything I've said? Then you should like the video, comment down below, and subscribe to the channel. With all that said, until next time, The Witching Hour, signing off.